The black dot theory. The black dot theory represents a nuanced approach to psychological manipulation that operates through the strategic deployment of minor inconsistencies and subtle alterations in a target's environment. Unlike overt manipulation techniques that rely on direct confrontation or obvious deception, the black dot theory exploits the human mind's inherent vulnerabilities in perception, memory, and reality construction through almost imperceptible interventions. Fundamental principles. At its core, the black dot theory operates on the premise that human perception and memory are not objective recording mechanisms, but interpretive processes vulnerable to disruption. The name itself derives from the concept that a small black dot placed strategically on a white page draws disproportionate attention and disrupts the viewer's perception of the entire page. Similarly, small inconsistencies in one's environment can disproportionately impact one's overall sense of reality. The theory exploits several key psychological vulnerabilities. Confirmation bias. Once a person begins to doubt their memory or perception, they become hypervigilant for further evidence of unreliability, often misinterpreting normal occurrences as additional evidence. Cognitive dissonance. When faced with environmental inconsistencies, the mind struggles to reconcile contradictory information, creating psychological distress that demands resolution, and often through accepting explanations that undermine self-trust. Perceptual adaptation. Humans naturally adapt to gradual changes without conscious awareness, making it difficult to detect slow, incremental alterations to the environment. Memory reconstruction. Memory doesn't function like a recording, but is reconstructed each time we recall something, making it vulnerable to suggestion and contamination with each retrieval. Attribution error. When unexplained discrepancies occur, people often attribute them to internal factors, their own forgetfulness or inattention, rather than external manipulation, particularly when the changes seem insignificant. Methodology and application. The implementation of the black dot theory typically involves several methodological elements, carefully calibrated to remain below the threshold of definitive detection. 1. Environmental manipulation. The most common application involves subtle alterations to the target's physical environment, object displacement, moving items slightly from their usual positions, a few inches rather than feet, creating a sense that something is off, without being immediately identifiable. Examples include shifting furniture slightly, repositioning decorative items, or changing the order of books on a shelf. Quantity alterations. Adding or removing small numbers of items from collections or sets. For instance, removing 2 paper clips from a box of hundreds, adding an extra pen to a holder, or removing 1 photograph from a multi-picture frame. Temporal manipulations. Adjusting clocks or watches by small increments in 2-3 minutes, periodically, creating cumulative confusion about time perception. Sensory adjustments. Making slight changes to environmental conditions such as room temperature, lighting intensity, or ambient noise levels in patterns that create subliminal discomfort without clear cause. Arrangement modifications. Changing the organizational patterns of items, reversing the order of clothes in a closet, reorganizing kitchen items, or altering desk arrangements in subtle ways. 2. Information distortion. Beyond physical environment manipulation, the theory extends to information management. Document alterations. Making minor changes to documents or digital files, changing dates slightly, altering single digits in numbers, or subtly rewording sections of text. Communication inconsistencies. Deliberately misremembering or misrepresenting previous conversations, denying statements that were made or claiming statements that weren't. Selective information provision. Controlling what information reaches the target, creating gaps or contradictions in their knowledge base that generate confusion. Digital alterations in modern contexts. Making subtle changes to digital environments, rearranging desktop icons, changing browser bookmarks, or altering settings incrementally. Narrative reconstruction. Reframing past events by emphasizing different details or introducing slight variations in repeated retellings of shared experiences. 3. Implementation protocols. Effective application follows specific protocols to maintain plausible deniability and maximize a psychological impact. Gradual progression. Changes begin with extremely subtle alterations that escalate in significance over time as the target's certainty becomes increasingly compromised. Pattern inconsistency. Avoiding detectable patterns in the timing or nature of changes, ensuring manipulations appear random rather than systematic. Strategic attribution. providing plausible alternative explanations for discrepancies that direct blame toward the target's memory, attention, or perception rather than external factors. Selective confirmation, occasionally acknowledging the target's correct observations to prevent complete breakdown of trust, while continuing to undermine certainty in other areas. Gaslighting integration, combining environmental manipulations with verbal gaslighting techniques that deny, minimize, or reframe the target's concerns about inconsistencies. Psychological impact. The cumulative effect of these subtle manipulations creates profound psychological consequences that extend far beyond the scale of the interventions themselves. Reality uncertainty. Victims develop fundamental doubt about their ability to perceive and interpret their environment accurately, creating chronic anxiety and hypervigilance. Cognitive exhaustion. Constant reality checking and attempting to reconcile inconsistencies depletes cognitive resources, leading to mental fatigue and reduced functioning in other areas. Dependency formation. As self-trust erodes, victims become increasingly dependent on external validation, particularly from the manipulator who can selectively provide confirmation of reality. Identity destabilization. Since stable perception is fundamental to identity, persistent perceptual disruption can undermine a person's sense of self and agency. Learned helplessness. Over time, victims often abandon attempts to trust their own perceptions, accepting a passive stance toward reality interpretation that extends beyond the manipulated contexts. Isolation tendencies. Fearing they will appear irrational, victims frequently avoid sharing their experiences, increasing their isolation and vulnerability to further manipulation. Contextual applications. The Black theory has been identified in various manipulative contexts. Intimate relationship abuse. In abusive relationships, manipulators employ these techniques to establish psychological dominance without resorting to physical violence that might leave evidence or trigger intervention. The progressive nature of these tactics often means victims don't recognize the manipulation until their reality perception is significantly compromised. Common implementations include personal item manipulation, moving or hiding personal belongings that hold emotional significance, then finding them in places the victim allegedly left them. Selective memory challenges, consistently contradicting the victim's recollection of events, particularly regarding agreements, promises, or conflicts. Environmental control, making subtle changes to shared living spaces while the victim is away, then denying any alterations were made. Privacy boundary breaches, accessing private communications or personal spaces and leaving almost imperceptible evidence of the intrusion to create anxiety without providing grounds for definitive confrontation. Organizational manipulation. In workplace or organizational contexts, similar techniques can be employed to undermine targeted individuals or establish control mechanisms. Document inconsistencies, creating minor discrepancies in work products or communications that make the target appear careless or incompetent. Workspace alterations, making subtle changes to the target's workspace during their absence, reorganizing files, adjusting equipment settings, or relocating materials. Communication distortion, slightly misrepresenting information in meetings or emails when recounting the target's statements or commitments. Procedural shifting, incrementally altering established procedures without clear notification, then expressing concern when the target fails to adapt. Selective feedback provision, withholding critical information or providing it inconsistently, creating knowledge gaps that lead to performance issues. Intelligence operations. Historical examples from intelligence agencies demonstrate how these principles can be applied in counterintelligence or psychological operations. Operational environment manipulation. Intelligence services have used subtle environmental changes to create anxiety in targets, making them more vulnerable to recruitment or compromise. Surveillance indication. Deliberately leaving minimal evidence of surveillance to create psychological pressure without providing actionable proof that could be addressed through countermeasures. Acceptabilization. Creating minor inconsistencies in an intelligence target's environment to induce stress and irrational behavior that might compromise their position or effectiveness. False flag attribution, making small manipulations appear to be the work of a different actor, creating misdirected suspicion and response. Detection and defense. Recognizing and countering black dot manipulations presents significant challenges precisely because they operate below the threshold of definitive confirmation. However, Several protective strategies have proven effective: environmental anchoring, creating irrefutable reference points through photographs, measurements, or 30 verification of environmental conditions, documentation practices, maintaining detailed records of conversations, agreements, and environmental states to counter gaslighting about past events or conditions. Pattern recognition, developing awareness of statistical anomalies in unexplained discrepancies, which may reveal intentional manipulation beneath apparently random occurrences. Trust network development, establishing relationships with individuals who have no connection to potential manipulators, providing independent reality verification. Technological verification, using technology to verify memory and perception security cameras, time-stamped photographs, or digital tracking systems that record environmental states. Metacognitive awareness, developing understanding of one's own cognitive vulnerabilities and perceptual processes to distinguish between normal cognitive errors and systematic manipulation. Ethical implications. Understanding the black dot theory raises significant ethical considerations across multiple domains. Clinical recognition. Mental health professionals must develop discernment between symptoms of perceptual disorders and legitimate experiences of environmental manipulation, avoiding misdiagnosis of victims as experiencing paranoia or psychosis. Legal standards. The justice system faces challenges in addressing psychological manipulation that leaves no physical evidence, raising questions about how to establish standards of proof for this form of abuse. Digital dimension. As technology creates new opportunities for subtle manipulation of digital environments, questions emerge about privacy protections and detection methods for technological implementations of these techniques. Research ethics. Studying these phenomena presents ethical challenges regarding experimental design and participant welfare when investigating potentially harmful psychological mechanisms. Contemporary relevance. In modern contexts, the principles underlying the black dot theory have found new applications and increased potency. Digital augmentation. Technology enables more sophisticated environmental manipulation through smart home devices, digital communications, and online accounts that can be subtly altered without physical access. Reality fragmentation. In an era where digital and physical realities increasingly blend, the opportunities for creating perceptual inconsistencies have multiplied. Information overload. Cognitive taxation from constant information processing makes modern individuals more vulnerable to missing subtle inconsistencies or attributing them to their own overloaded attention systems. Automated implementation. Technologies enable the automation of subtle manipulations that previously would have required considerable human effort to implement consistently. Conclusion. The black dot theory illuminates how minimal interventions in a person's environment can create disproportionate psychological effects when strategically implemented over time. By exploiting fundamental vulnerabilities in human perception, memory, and reality construction, these techniques can effectively undermine a person's most basic trust in their own experience. Understanding these mechanisms serves multiple important purposes: helping potential victims recognize and counter such manipulation, assisting professional helpers in properly identifying and addressing these experiences, and informing broader social and legal frameworks that might protect against these subtle but profoundly damaging forms of psychological manipulation. The most effective protection remains a combination of awareness, documentation, external verification, and strong supportive relationships that can help maintain reality anchoring even when one's personal perceptual systems are under attack. As both understanding of human psychology and technological capabilities continue to advance, maintaining awareness of these subtle manipulation techniques becomes increasingly important for psychological well-being and autonomy in complex social environments. Ethical mirroring. Ethical mirroring represents a sophisticated form of psychological manipulation in which the manipulator strategically adopts and reflects the moral framework, ethical principles and value system of their target while simultaneously working to undermine these very foundations. Unlike simpler forms of deception, ethical mirroring involves a deep mimicry of the target's most cherished beliefs and principles, creating a powerful but artificial sense of shared ethical identity that bypasses normal protective skepticism. Core mechanics and psychological foundation. At its foundation, ethical mirroring exploits several fundamental psychological vulnerabilities: similarity attraction principle, Humans naturally trust and favor those who appear similar to themselves, particularly regarding core values and beliefs. When someone mirrors our ethical framework, we experience a powerful and often unconscious positive bias toward them. This psychological principle is so strong that it frequently overrides rational assessment of behavior and evidence. Confirmation bias. People naturally seek information that confirms their existing beliefs while discounting contradictory evidence. When someone appears to share our moral framework, we become predisposed to interpret their actions in ways that reinforce this perception, often ignoring or rationalizing behaviors that would otherwise raise concern. Moral identity protection. Individuals generally view their ethical frameworks as central to their identity. When someone appears to share this moral identity, questioning their authenticity feels like questioning one's own judgment and values, creating powerful psychological resistance to recognizing manipulation. Trust transference. Trust established in one domain as shared ethical values unconsciously transfers to other domains, so financial decisions, personal confidences, loyalty assessment, even when this extension is unwarranted by objective evidence. The implementation process. Effective ethical mirroring typically progresses through several distinct phases. 1. Intelligence gathering and analysis. Before attempting mirroring, skilled manipulators conduct thorough research on their targets, moral framework, ethical triggers, and value hierarchy. This intelligence phase might involve social media analysis, examining public statements, reactions, and endorsements that reveal core values and moral priorities. Network infiltration. Establishing connections with individuals in the target's social circle to gather insights about their ethical positioning and moral history. Trigger identification. Determining which ethical violations most strongly activate the target's emotional responses, identifying their moral buttons. A value hierarchy mapping. Understanding which ethical principles the target prioritizes when values conflict, revealing their deeper moral architecture. 2. Calibrated revelation and reinforcement. Rather than immediately claiming complete ethical alignment, sophisticated manipulators gradually reveal apparently shared values through a process of calibrated disclosure. Staged discovery, creating seemingly spontaneous situations where shared values are discovered, making the connection appear authentic rather than strategic. Ethical testing. Introducing minor moral dilemmas to observe the target's responses, then calibrating subsequent mirroring to match with greater precision. Selective self-disclosure. Sharing personal narratives that have been crafted to emphasize ethical similarities while obscuring differences or contradictory history. Value amplification. Expressing the target's own values with slightly greater intensity, positioning the manipulator as an even more committed adherent to these principles. 3. Contrast creation. To strengthen the perception of ethical alignment, manipulators often introduce contrast figures or situations, ethical foils. Identifying or introducing third parties who violate the shared ethical framework, creating opportunities for the manipulator and target to experience moral solidarity through mutual disapproval. Manufactured ethical challenges. Creating situations where the manipulator appears to make sacrifices to uphold the shared values, demonstrating apparent commitment beyond mere words. Moral outrage synchronization. Expressing indignation at the same ethical violations that trigger the target's moral concerns, creating emotional resonance that strengthens the perceived ethical connection. 4. Trust exploitation and value subversion. Once sufficient trust has been established through apparent ethical alignment, the manipulator begins the exploitation phase. Incremental boundary testing, gradually requesting small exceptions to ethical rules, often framed as necessary compromises in service of the broader shared values. Ethical reframing. Subtly shifting the interpretation of shared values to accommodate the manipulator's objectives, redefining what constitutes adherence to the principles rather than directly challenging them. Compartmentalization encouragement, promoting separation between different ethical domains, allowing violations in one area to be justified while maintaining the appearance of overall moral consistency. Reciprocity leverage, invoking the target's ethical framework to create obligations, using their own moral principles to justify compliance with the manipulator's requests. Applications and contexts. Ethical mirroring appears across diverse contexts, adapted to the specific objectives of different types of manipulators' financial and economic exploitation. In financial contexts, Ethical mirroring creates the trust necessary for significant resource transfer, investment. Fraud manipulators identify and mirror the ethical frameworks of potential investors, positioning fraudulent schemes as aligned with the target's moral values, e.g., presenting Ponzi schemes as supporting religious causes to religious targets. Affinity fraud, exploiting shared group identity by mimicking the ethical framework associated with a particular community, using apparent moral alignment to bypass financial due diligence. Ethical business manipulation, presenting business opportunities as consistent with the target's moral priorities, as sustainability, social justice, religious values, while concealing practices that contradict these principles. Operational infiltration. Organizations with strong ethical identities are particularly vulnerable to infiltration via ethical mirroring, intelligence penetration. State actors and corporate espionage specialists use ethical mirroring to infiltrate organizations with strong moral identities, from activist groups to religious institutions. Competitive undermining. Corporate competitors may place individuals who mirror the ethical framework of rival organizations to gain insider information or influence decision-making processes. Ideological sabotage. Political operatives may infiltrate movements by mirroring their ethical principles while working to redirect or undermine their effectiveness. Interpersonal manipulation. In personal relationships, ethical mirroring creates particularly deep vulnerability, romantic deception, presenting as a perfect ethical match while concealing contradictory values or intentions, creating relationships founded on artificial moral alignment. Friendship exploitation. Establishing connections based on apparently shared moral frameworks to gain access to resources, connections, or opportunities. Family system manipulation. Individuals may mirror the ethical frameworks of family members to secure inheritance, caregiving resources, or decision-making influence. Detection and defense mechanisms. Recognizing and protecting against ethical mirroring presents significant challenges precisely because it targets deeply held values and identity structures. However, several strategies can enhance resistance. Behavioral consistency analysis. Rather than focusing exclusively on stated values, effective defense requires careful attention to behavioral patterns, action, statement alignment, systematically comparing expressed ethical positions with actual behavior in low-stakes situations, identifying discrepancies between moral claims and choices, ethical stress testing, observing responses to unexpected ethical challenges that haven't been prepared for in advance, revealing authentic rather than performed moral reflexes. Value hierarchy consistency. Noting whether the prioritization of different ethical principles remains consistent across contexts or shifts opportunistically to align with immediate advantages. Relationship pattern recognition. Ethical mirroring often leaves detectable patterns in relationship development, accelerated intimacy, unusually rapid establishment of apparent moral alignment and ethical communion, particularly when compared to the natural pace of authentic value discovery. Convenience alignment. Ethical positions that seem suspiciously calibrated to match the target's framework without the normal variations expected, even among those with similar moral foundations. Selective ethics activation. Heightened ethical concern in areas visible to the target, while demonstrating indifference to moral considerations when unobserved or in contexts seemingly unrelated to the primary relationship. Cognitive protection strategies. Developing specific cognitive habits can provide significant protection. Ethical decisional independence. Making moral judgments before seeking input from the potential manipulator. Establishing an independent position that can't be preemptively mirrored. Provisional trust philosophy. Adopting a framework where trust is continuously earned rather than permanently granted, requiring ongoing evidence of ethical alignment rather than relying on initial impressions. Value separate assessment. Deliberately evaluating competence, reliability, and to trustworthiness independently from apparent value alignment to prevent ethical mirroring from contaminating practical judgments. The neuroscience of vulnerability. Recent neuroscientific research helps explain why ethical mirroring proves so effective and difficult to detect. Mirror neuron activation. When we perceive someone sharing our moral reactions, mirror neuron systems create a neural resonance that generates powerful feelings of connection and understanding. Oxytocin release. Perceived similarity in moral values triggers oxytocin release, promoting trust and positive bias toward the manipulator while suppressing critical assessment. Cognitive dissonance avoidance. The brain experiences discomfort when evidence contradicts the established perception of shared values, often resolving this dissonance by discounting contradictory evidence rather than revising the fundamental trust assessment. Cultural and contextual variations. The implementation and effectiveness of ethical mirroring varies significantly across different cultural contexts. Individualist vs. collectivist cultures. In highly individualistic societies, ethical mirroring often emphasizes personal autonomy and individual rights, while in collectivist contexts, it targets values related to group harmony and collective responsibility. High vs. low trust environments. In societies with generally high social trust, ethical mirroring can operate more rapidly with less scrutiny, while low trust environments require more sophisticated and prolonged implementation. Explicit vs. implicit value systems. Cultures with highly codified ethical systems, religious communities, ideological groups provide manipulators with clearer targets for mirroring, while contexts with more implicit moral codes require greater intuitive calibration. Contemporary evolution and digital dimensions. Modern technological and social developments have created new opportunities for ethical mirroring, digital identity construction. Social media platforms enable manipulators to construct elaborate ethical personas over time, creating documented histories of apparent moral alignment before any direct contact occurs. Algorithmic value analysis. Advanced data analytics allow systematic analysis of a target's moral framework through their digital footprint, enabling precisely calibrated mirroring strategies. Virtual relationship acceleration. Online interactions can compress the timeline of apparent ethical discovery, allowing manipulators to establish perceived moral alignment more rapidly than in traditional contexts. Scalable implementation. Digital technologies enable simultaneous ethical mirroring toward multiple targets, allowing manipulators to engage in parallel operations that would be impossible in traditional settings. Ethical implications and societal impact. The prevalence of ethical mirroring raises significant concerns about social trust and ethical development. Trust erosion effects. Widespread experience with ethical mirroring can create generalized skepticism about moral alignment, potentially damaging authentic ethical connection among community members. Vulnerability disparity. Individuals and groups with strong explicit moral frameworks of religious communities, activist organizations, may face disproportionate targeting, creating inequitable vulnerability distribution. Moral development challenges. The threat of manipulation through ethical mirroring can discourage open expression of moral frameworks, potentially inhibiting important ethical discourse and development. Conclusion. Ethical mirroring represents one of the most sophisticated forms of psychological manipulation, precisely because it operates at the level of identity and fundamental values rather than merely superficial preferences or interests. By creating the appearance of shared moral architecture, manipulators bypass critical evaluation mechanisms and establish trust that can be exploited across multiple domains. The most effective protection against ethical mirroring involves a combination of behavioral analysis, relationship pattern recognition, and cognitive strategies that separate value alignment assessment from practical trustworthiness evaluation. As both technological capabilities and understanding of moral psychology continue to advance, developing effective defenses against ethical mirroring becomes increasingly important for maintaining authentic relationships and protecting vulnerable individuals and organizations from exploitation through their most deeply held values. Understanding these mechanisms serves not only protective purposes but also offers insight into authentic ethical connection, highlighting the importance of consistency, behavioral integrity, and gradual trust development in establishing genuine moral relationships in both personal and professional contexts. The Zersetzung Method. The Zersetzung Method represents one of the most sophisticated systems of psychological warfare ever developed by a state agency against its own citizens. Originating from the German word meaning decomposition or corrosion, this approach was perfected by the Ministry for State Security, the Ministerium für Staatssicherheit, commonly known as the Stasi in the German Democratic Republic, East Germany during the Cold War era. Unlike conventional persecution methods that relied on physical torture or imprisonment, Zersetzung operated through invisible means to methodically dismantle an individual's psychological stability, social connections, and professional standing. Historical context and development. The Stasi developed Zersetzung as a response to international pressure regarding human rights abuses in the late 1970s and early 1980s. As East Germany sought greater international legitimacy, particularly from Western nations, crude methods of oppression became politically problematic. Under the leadership of Erich Mielke, the Stasi shifted toward silent methods of neutralizing perceived enemies of the state: dissidents, activists, intellectuals, and anyone deemed potentially subversive to the socialist regime. Directive 1076, issued in 1976, formalized these techniques and provided official guidelines for Stasi officers. This directive specifically outlined methods for systematic degradation of reputation, image, and prestige on the basis of true, verifiable and discrediting information together with untrue, credible, irrefutable, and thus discrediting information, the core principles and methodology. The fundamental aim of Zersetzung was to destroy the target's sense of coherence about their life and reality. This was achieved through several interconnected approaches. 1. Intelligence gathering. The foundation of effective Zersetzung operations was comprehensive intelligence about the target. The Stasi would compile exhaustive profiles including personal habits, routines, and schedules, psychological vulnerabilities, and family dynamics and potential sources of conflict, professional aspirations and insecurities, social networks and relationship, medical history and health principles, politics, this intelligence Mitarbeit und Nährlichkeit, who could often involve net colleagues, who could be gathered moral principles and relationship dynamics, friends or even family members of the target. At its peak, the Stasi maintained approximately one informant for every 6.5 citizens, creating an unprecedented surveillance network. 2. Customized psychological disruption. Using the gathered intelligence, Stasi officers would design personalized campaigns to exploit specific vulnerabilities. Their goal was to create a perfect psychological storm that would appear as a series of unconnected misfortunes rather than deliberate persecution. Tactics included environmental manipulation, entering a target's home while they were away and making subtle changes, moving furniture slightly, changing alarm clock settings, replacing personal items with similar but different versions, or rearranging belongings. These alterations were designed to be just noticeable enough to create unease, but subtle enough that complaining about them would sound paranoid. Artificial personal crisis, creating situations that would trigger emotional distress or practical problems. For instance, sending false information to employers about misconduct, arranging for romantic partners to receive compromising, often falsified information about infidelity, or manipulating conflicts between family members. Strategic character assassination, spreading damaging rumors throughout a person's social and professional networks. These rumors would often contain elements of truth combined with fabrications, making them difficult to disprove completely. The rumors would be tailored to particularly damage the person within their specific community, questioning a teacher's appropriateness with children, implying an activist was secretly working for the state, suggesting a business person was embezzling funds. Administrative harassment, creating bureaucratic obstacles and inconveniences such as continuous tax audits, lost applications, missed appointments, cancelled services, or denied permits. Each individual instance could be explained as normal administrative error, but collectively they created significant disruption. 3. Social network destruction. A primary goal of Zersetzung was to isolate the target by systematically destroying their social relationships, creation of mistrust, planting doubts about the target's loyalty, honesty, or mental stability among their friends, colleagues, and family. This often involved falsified evidence of betrayal or inappropriate behavior. Relationship sabotage, manipulating misunderstandings between the target and their significant relationships. This might involve intercepting and altering communications, creating situations that would trigger conflicts, or exploiting existing tensions. Professional undermining, interfering with the target's career by arranging failures, creating impressions of incompetence, or suggesting political unreliability to employers. In the East German context, where political conformity was essential for professional advancement, this was particularly effective. Controlled opposition, infiltrating the target's support networks with informants who would provide artificial friendship while gathering information and subtly influencing group dynamics in destructive ways. For creation of contradictory experiences, A particularly insidious aspect of Zersetzung was the creation of contradictory experiences that made victims question their own perception of reality, gaslighting, manipulating situations to make the target question their memory or perception. For example, Stasi agents might return items previously stolen from a target's home, replace broken items with working ones before complaints could be verified, or deny conversations that had occurred. False validation, occasionally providing positive experiences or successes to prevent the target from identifying a clear pattern of harassment. This unpredictability was designed to create confusion and prevent adaptation to the persecution. Engineered coincidences, creating unlikely coincidences that would seem meaningful to the target but meaningless to others, fostering a sense of paranoia or magical thinking that would undermine the target's credibility if expressed publicly. Implementation and scale. The implementation of Zersetzung required extensive resources and coordination. Operations would typically involve a case officer who designed and oversaw the overall strategy and network of informants in the target's social circle, technical specialists for surveillance, break-ins, and wiretapping analytical staff to process information and identify vulnerabilities, administrative personnel to coordinate actions across multiple agencies. At its height, approximately 5,000 people were subjected to systematic Zersetzung operations, while thousands more experienced less comprehensive versions of these techniques. The Stasi employed approximately 91,000 full-time officers and maintained a network of around 189,000 informants to support these operations, representing an extraordinary commitment of state resources to psychological warfare against its own citizens. Psychological impact on victims. The effects of Zersetzung on victims were profound and often permanent. Common psychological impacts included paranoia and hypervigilance. Victims developed persistent suspicion and an inability to trust even basic interactions, leading to constant anxiety and stress. Social withdrawal. As relationships became sources of pain and betrayal, many victims retreated from social connections entirely, enhancing their isolation. Professional destruction. Career disruptions often led to financial insecurity, loss of purpose, and diminished self-worth. Identity disintegration. The constant undermining of fundamental life aspects led many victims to lose their sense of coherent identity and purpose. Reality testing problems. The deliberate manipulation of perception created lasting difficulties in distinguishing between genuine events and manufactured ones. Psychosomatic illnesses. The chronic stress produced by Zersetzung frequently manifested in physical health problems including digestive disorders, cardiovascular issues, immune system dysfunction, and chronic pain conditions. Following German reunification, many victims continued to experience these effects decades after the operations ended. The invisible nature of the persecution made recovery particularly challenging, as victims often lacked external validation of their experiences and struggled to reconstruct a coherent narrative of what had happened to them. Modern applications and parallels. While the Stasi's systematic application of Zersetzung ended with German reunification, similar techniques have been documented in various contexts. Intelligence agencies. Several modern intelligence services have employed comparable methods against designated targets, particularly in counter-terrorism and counterintelligence operations. These approaches are sometimes justified as disruption tactics or neutralization strategies that avoid direct legal confrontation. Workplace mobbing. Organizational psychologists have identified patterns in workplace harassment that mirror aspects of Zersetzung, where targeted individuals face coordinated campaigns of subtle undermining, social isolation, and professional sabotage. Cyberstalking and online harassment. Digital technologies have enabled distributed harassment campaigns that employ psychological principles similar to Zersetzung, including coordinated social attacks, reputation damage, and reality distortion. Domestic abuse. Of some patterns of psychological domestic abuse demonstrate striking similarities to Zersetzung techniques, particularly around environmental manipulation, social isolation, and reality distortion. Detection and countermeasures. Due to its deliberately subtle nature, Zersetzung was designed to be difficult to identify and counter. However, several protective factors have been identified through studying survivors' documentation. Maintaining detailed records of unusual incidents helped some victims establish patterns that would otherwise seem like unconnected events. External reality testing. Regular community individuals, completely outside the target's normal social circles, sometimes provided objective perspective that counteracted reality distortion efforts. Transparency strategy. Some victims found that openly discussing strange occurrences with multiple people reduced the effectiveness of gaslighting techniques by creating external validation. Intentional unpredictability, varying routines and communications methods occasionally disrupted intelligence gathering and made targeting more difficult. Technological countermeasures. In modern contexts, security measures like encrypted communications, surveillance detection, and digital hygiene practices can limit information gathering capabilities. Ethical and historical significance. The Zersetzung method represents a watershed in the evolution of state repression techniques. Its significance extends beyond its immediate historical context in several ways in psychological warfare innovation. It demonstrated how sophisticated understanding of psychology could be weaponized as effectively as physical violence, creating a template for non-violent coercion that leaves few evident traces. Documentary legacy. Thanks to the preservation of Stasi archives following German reunification, Zersetzung is uniquely well documented compared to similar programs in other authoritarian contexts, providing valuable insights into systematic psychological operations. Ethical boundaries. The Zersetzung program raises profound questions about the boundaries between legitimate intelligence activities and human rights violations when physical violence is absent but psychological harm is deliberately inflicted. Warning mechanism. Understanding the mechanics of Zersetzung provides a framework for identifying similar patterns in contemporary contexts, helping to detect early warning signs of systematic psychological targeting. Conclusion. The Zersetzung method stands as one of history's most sophisticated applications of psychological warfare against individuals. Its effectiveness stemmed from its invisibility, by avoiding direct confrontation and operating through seemingly unconnected incidents. It created a form of persecution that was difficult to identify, resist, or prove. The psychological damage inflicted through these techniques often outlasted the operations themselves, demonstrating how profoundly human psychology can be affected by systematic manipulation of perception and social connection. The documentation of Zersetzung techniques serves as an important historical lesson about the evolution of repressive methods and the vulnerability of individuals to coordinated psychological operations. As surveillance capabilities and behavioral understanding continue to advance in the digital age, the Stasi's methodological approach remains relevant as both a warning and a framework for recognizing similar patterns in contemporary contexts. Gaslight layering is a sophisticated manipulation technique that goes beyond basic gaslighting. While traditional gaslighting targets specific events or perceptions, gaslight layering systematically constructs multiple interconnected layers of false narratives that eventually replace a victim's entire reality framework. Foundational mechanics. Gaslight layering creates a scaffolding of deception that builds upon itself. The manipulator doesn't simply deny reality. They construct an alternative one through carefully crafted layers of misinformation that interact with and reinforce each other. The process typically follows these stages. 1. Foundation setting. The manipulator establishes basic trust and authority while subtly undermining the victim's confidence. 2. Reality destabilization. Through consistent denial and contradiction, the manipulator creates fundamental doubt about objective reality. 3. Alternative narrative introduction. As the victim's grip on their perceptions weakens, the manipulator introduces the first layer of false narrative, often containing elements of truth for credibility. 4. Narrative reinforcement. The manipulator provides evidence or enlists others to validate the false narrative. 5. Layered expansion. Additional narrative layers are gradually introduced, each building upon previous ones. 6. Integration enforcement. The victim is rewarded for accepting these narratives and punished for questioning them. 7. Reality reconstruction. Eventually, the victim adopts these layered narratives as their new reality framework. Psychological mechanisms. Gaslight layering exploits several vulnerabilities. Cognitive consistency. Humans seek consistent explanations for experiences. When faced with contradictions, victims often question their own perceptions rather than challenge authority figures. Memory malleability. Human memory is reconstructive. Each recall rebuilds that memory, making it vulnerable to suggestion. Over time, false narratives can become incorporated into memories. Identity destabilization. By undermining fundamental perceptions, gaslight layering attacks the victim's sense of self, making identity increasingly dependent on the manipulator's definitions. Emotional dependency. The confusion and self-doubt created drives victims to rely on the manipulator for stability and validation. Applications. Cults and ideological groups. Cults employ gaslight layering effectively because they control multiple aspects of members' environments. They create layered narratives about the outside world, portraying it as dangerous or corrupt. The cult leader attributing special powers or divine connection. Members' past lives reframing pre-cult experiences as meaningless. Alternative explanations for any contradictions within the cult's teachings are, for example, a cult might first establish that mainstream society is fundamentally deceptive and layer 1, then that only the leader can perceive true reality, a layer 2, followed by convincing members that negative emotions toward cult practices represent spiritual contamination, layer 3, and finally that questioning any doctrine demonstrates infiltration by malevolent forces, a layer 4. Abusive relationships. In domestic abuse contexts, gaslight layering often progresses through and establishing the abuser as the authority on normal relationship dynamics, or defining the victim's emotions as irrational or pathological, creating false narratives, and family, who might offer perspectives for developing explanation. An abuser might unconfirm the victim, that begin layer 1, that controlling be the place responsibility their part victim, friend they faves and family who might offer alternative victim. Then suggest that the victim's discomfort indicates emotional damage from their past, layer 2. They might reinterpret family concerns as jealousy, layer 3. And finally convince the victim that abuse occurs only because the victim provokes it, layer 4. Organizational settings. In toxic workplace environments, gaslight layering can manifest as rewriting company history to serve current leadership narratives and normalizing exploitative practices by reframing them as opportunities, creating false narratives about former employees who left free, layered explanations that shield my toxic organization. Layer. Say my exit versus that extraordinary cases press that establish my leadership treatment, building left due to mistreatment. Frame employee burnout as personal weakness, at layer 2. Portray competitor companies with better conditions as doomed to fail, at layer 3. And establish that questioning practices demonstrates disloyalty, at layer 4. Political propaganda. In political contexts, gaslight layering serves as a tool for a gradually shifting public perception about opponents, rewriting historical events to serve current narratives, creating layered justifications for controversial policies, establishing false equivalencies that undermine clear judgment. A political entity might information source about information sources, layer 1 intruders, layer 1. Provide alternative facts, at layer 2. Create conspiracy theories to explain why experts disagree, at layer 3. And establish that questioning the official narrative indicates one is an enemy, at layer 4. Detection and defense. Warning signs include escalating doubt, questioning increasingly fundamental aspects of your reality, narrative complexity, explanations becoming increasingly convoluted, external validation restriction, being discouraged from seeking outside perspectives, identity erosion, feeling increasingly uncertain about your traits and history, reality testing interference, being discouraged from keeping records that might contradict narratives. Defense strategies include external reality anchors, maintaining connections with people outside the manipulator's influence, documentation, keeping journals or other evidence of events, pattern recognition, identifying when explanations become suspiciously complex, cognitive boundary setting, developing permission to trust one's perceptions even when they contradict authority figures, professional support, working with therapists experienced in manipulation recovery, neurological impact. Under prolonged manipulation, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for critical thinking, shows decreased activity, while the amygdala, associated with emotional responses, becomes hyperactive. This makes victims more reactive to emotional cues while impairing logical evaluation. Additionally, neuroplasticity means that each time false narratives are recalled, they strengthen neural pathways associated with these constructed memories while weakening connections to accurate recollections. Long-term psychological effects. Extended exposure to gaslight layering often results in reality processing disorders, persistent difficulty trusting one's perceptions, identity fragmentation, struggling to reconstruct a coherent sense of self, Hypervigilance, remaining constantly alert for potential manipulation. Epistemic mistrust, developing fundamental skepticism about all information sources. Attachment disorders, difficulty forming healthy relationships due to ingrained patterns of doubt. Recovery typically requires specialized therapeutic approaches addressing cognitive restructuring, emotional healing, and identity reconstruction. Conclusion. Gaslight layering is destructive because it operates on multiple levels simultaneously, creating a self-reinforcing system that can replace a victim's entire perceptual framework. The most effective protection remains external reality checks, strong boundaries, critical thinking skills, and healthy social connections that provide alternative perspectives when one's reality testing abilities are compromised. Understanding both vulnerability factors and effective interventions continues to develop, offering hope for more effective prevention and recovery strategies for those affected by this profound form of psychological manipulation. Double-bind entrapment represents one of the more insidious forms of psychological manipulation. This tactic creates a situation where a person is presented with two choices, both leading to negative outcomes. The manipulator constructs this scenario deliberately to create mental paralysis, ensuring the victim feels trapped regardless of which option they select. The mechanics of double-bind entrapment. At its core, double-bind entrapment involves presenting someone with a choice between two options where both result in harm or loss. The manipulator carefully constructs the scenario so that 1. The victim perceives only two possible choices. 2. Both choices lead to negative consequences. 3. The victim cannot discuss the contradiction or leave the situation. 4. The victim cannot communicate about the impossible situation. The power of this technique lies in its ability to create cognitive dissonance and emotional distress. When faced with two unacceptable options, people often freeze, becoming incapable of making any decision at all. This state of paralysis benefits the manipulator by maintaining control over the victim. Historical background. The concept of the double bind was first described by anthropologist Gregory Bateson and his research team in the 1950s. They initially studied it within the context of schizophrenia, suggesting that children who regularly experience double binds from their parents might develop schizophrenic symptoms as a coping mechanism. While this specific theory has been debated, the concept of the double bind has proven valuable in understanding manipulative relationships. Common double bind scenarios. Double binds appear in various relationships and contexts. 1. Romantic relationships. If you spend time with your friends, you don't love me. If you only spend time with me, you're too clingy. 2. Professional settings. Take initiative, but don't do anything without permission. 3. Parenting. Grow up and be independent. Don't do anything without asking me first. 4. Political discourse. If you support policy A, you're abandoning group X. If you don't support policy A, you're abandoning group Y. The psychological impact. The psychological effects of double-bind entrapment can be profound and far-reaching. 1. Decision paralysis. Victims become unable to make choices, fearing negative outcomes regardless of their decision. 2. Chronic anxiety. The constant state of mental conflict creates persistent anxiety. 3. Self-doubt. Victims begin questioning their own judgment and perception. 4. Learned helplessness. Over time, victims may stop trying to escape the situation, believing no solution exists. 5. Deteriorating mental health. Prolonged exposure can contribute to depression, anxiety disorders, and post-traumatic stress. Linguistic structures in double binds. Double binds often employ specific linguistic patterns that enhance their effectiveness. These include 1. Contradictory directives. Be spontaneous, which is impossible since following the directive means one is not being spontaneous. 2. Paradoxical injunctions. Don't be so obedient. If obeyed, the directive is violated. 3. Punitive framing. If you do X, you'll face consequence Y. If you don't do X, you'll face consequence Z. 4. False dichotomies. Presenting only two options when others exist. 5. Emotional blackmail. Using fear, obligation, or guilt to frame both choices. The language used in double binds often contains absolutes. Never, neverone, and no one. These terms help eliminate perceived middle ground or alternative options. Double binds in different contexts. Intimate relationships. In relationships, double binds often revolve around autonomy, loyalty, and emotional expression. A partner might say, if you truly loved me, you wouldn't need to spend time away from me. But I don't want someone clingy who has no independent life. This creates an impossible standard, where both independence and devotance are punished. In abusive relationships, double binds become particularly dangerous. If you leave me, I'll hurt myself. If you stay, you'll continue to suffer. This traps victims between concern for the abuser and their own well-being. Workplace dynamics. Organizations sometimes create double binds for employees. We want innovative thinking, but don't challenge established procedures. Employees facing such contradictions experience stress, reduced productivity, and diminished job satisfaction. Middle managers often find themselves in structural double binds, caught between upper management expectations and frontline employee needs, unable to satisfy both simultaneously. Family systems can develop entrenched double bind communication patterns, particularly when addressing difficult topics. Parents might tell a child, "But express your feelings honestly, but don't upset anyone." This creates an impossible standard for emotional expression. In dysfunctional families, double binds serve to maintain problematic dynamics. We want you to be successful, but don't outshine your siblings. Such communications prevent healthy development and individual growth. Cultural and societal double binds. Society often imposes double binds on various groups. 1. Women face expectations to be both assertive and nurturing, often being labeled either aggressive or too soft, regardless of their behavior. 2. Men are told to be emotionally expressive yet stoic, creating confusion about appropriate and masculine behavior. 3. Minority groups may be expected to assimilate while simultaneously being criticized for abandoning their cultural identity. 4. Professionals in certain fields face contradictory demands, such as teachers being expected to provide individualized attention while managing large class sizes with limited resources. Identifying double bind tactics. Recognizing doubled entrapment requires awareness of several key indicators. 1. No-win scenarios. All presented options lead to negative outcomes. 2. Contradictory demands. The expectations are inherently inconsistent. 3. Punishment for non-compliance. Clear negative consequences exist for any choice. 4. Prevention of meta-communication. Attempts to discuss the contradiction are shut down or punished. 5. Inability to leave the situation. Physical, financial, emotional, or social barriers prevent escape. 6. Recurring patterns. The same impossible scenarios repeat regularly. When these elements combine, they create the psychological trap that characterizes double bind entrapment. Manipulative applications of double binds. Those who understand the psychology of double binds can deliberately employ them to 1. Maintain control by creating decision paralysis. Manipulators prevent victims from taking independent action. 2. Justify abuser. You made me do this by choosing the wrong option. 3. Create dependency. When victims cannot trust their own judgment, they rely increasingly on the manipulator. 4. Deflect responsibility. I gave you a choice, you chose poorly. 5. Establish superiority. The manipulator positions themselves as the only one who can navigate the impossible situation. In sales and persuasion, subtler forms of double binds might be used. Do you want to pay now and save money, or pay later and waste money? This frames both options as purchases, eliminating the unstated third option of not buying at all. Breaking free from double bind entrapment. Escaping double bind traps requires several approaches. 1. Recognition. Identifying the double bind pattern is the crucial first step. 2. Expanding options. Actively seeking third alternatives beyond the presented dichotomy. 3. Meta-communication. Directly addressing the contradictory nature of the situation. 4. Setting boundaries. Refusing to engage with impossible demands. 5. Seeking external perspectives. Getting outside input can reveal options invisible to someone trapped in the dynamic. 6. Professional help. Therapists can assist in breaking entrenched patterns of thought created by long-term exposure to double binds. For example, someone facing the classic relationship double bind. If you loved me, you'd know what I want without me telling you. But I shouldn't have to tell you what I want. Might respond by meta-communicating. I understand you want me to anticipate your needs, but I also need clear communication. Let's find a balance that works for both of us. A defensive strategies against double bind manipulation. Developing resistance to double bind manipulation involves 1. Cultivating critical thinking skills to identify false dichotomies. 2. Practicing assertive communication techniques. 3. Building a support network that validates reality and provides perspective. 4. Learning to recognize emotional manipulation tactics. 5. Developing comfort with temporary discomfort when challenging manipulative frameworks. 6. Understanding that legitimate choices rarely come in the form of although ultimatums. An effective response might involve questioning the premiser. I don't accept that these are the only two options available. Let's discuss alternatives that could work for both of us. Double binds vs. legitimate difficult choices. It's important to distinguish between manipulative double binds and genuinely difficult choices. Not all hard decisions are double binds. Legitimate difficult choices 1. Present genuine trade-offs rather than punitive outcomes 2. Allow for open discussion of the dilemma 3. Acknowledge the difficulty of the situation 4. Don't include punishment for choosing either option 5. Often involve competing positive values rather than threatened negative consequences. For instance, choosing between two job offers might be difficult, but isn't a double bind if both have genuine advantages and disadvantages that can be openly evaluated. The ethical implications. Understanding double bind entrapment carries ethical responsibilities. This knowledge should be used for 1. Self-protectionizing when you're being manipulated. 2. Helping others. Supporting those trapped in double bind situations. 3. Improving communication, creating healthier interaction patterns. 4. Institutional reform. Identifying and changing systemic double binds in organizations. Using this knowledge to deliberately manipulate others is ethically problematic and contributes to psychological harm. Conclusion: double bind entrapment represents a sophisticated form of psychological manipulation with significant harmful effects. By creating situations where all available choices lead to negative outcomes, manipulators induce a state of mental paralysis that maintains control and prevents healthy autonomy. Understanding the mechanics, recognizing the patterns, and developing effective responses to double binds can help individuals protect themselves from this form of manipulation. Moreover, this knowledge can contribute to creating healthier communication patterns in relationships, workplaces, and broader social contexts. The ultimate antidote to double bind entrapment lies in expanded awareness, flexible thinking, and the courage to challenge false dichotomies. By recognizing that most situations offer more than two choices, individuals can break free from the artificial constraints imposed by manipulators and reclaim their autonomy and psychological well-being. Digital schizophrenia, new age dark psychology tactic. Imagine waking up one day and finding an email you don't remember sending, one that contains damaging statements you would never say, or seeing a video of yourself saying something you know you never said. People around you believe it's real, and no matter how much you deny it, the proof is right there. This is digital schizophrenia, a new age psychological manipulation tactic where digital deception is used to make someone doubt their own reality. Fake emails, deepfake videos, AI-generated messages. These tools are being weaponized to gaslight individuals, making them question their own actions, memories, and even sanity. The result? Paranoia, self-doubt, and in extreme cases, a complete mental breakdown. How digital schizophrenia works. This form of manipulation exploits our reliance on digital communication and recorded media. If something is written down, recorded, or documented, we tend to believe it. But with advanced AI, digital footprints can be manipulated, faked, or completely fabricated. Here's how it's done. 1. Fake emails and messages. Attackers create realistic-looking emails or texts that appear to come from the victim's own accounts. These messages can include confessions, offensive statements, or commitments the victim never made. When confronted, the victim is left confused and unable to prove their innocence. 2. Deepfake videos and voice cloning. AI can now create videos where a person appears to say or do something they never did. Voice cloning technology can generate fake phone calls or voicemails that sound exactly like the victim. These fabricated recordings can be used to blackmail, discredit. 3. AI-generated chat logs. Attackers use AI to create fake conversations that mimic real text messages from like WhatsApp, Telegram, or Discord. These chat logs can be used to frame someone or make them believe they had interactions they don't remember. 4. Manipulated digital footprints. Even metadata, timestamps, and IP addresses can be altered. This means someone could be framed for visiting a website, sending an email, or making a transaction they never actually did. Real-world examples. This isn't just theory. It's already happening. Here are a few real-world scenarios where digital schizophrenia has been used. A businessman was accused of fraud after his employer received an email from his account admitting to embezzlement. But he never sent the email. Hackers had spoofed his email address, creating a completely fabricated confession. A social media influencer was caught, in a video making racist remarks. The video spread quickly, and sponsors cut ties. Later, it was revealed that the video was a deepfake, but the damage to their reputation was already done. A woman manipulated her boyfriend into thinking he was cheating by creating fake text message exchanges. Over time, he started doubting his own memory and apologizing for things he never did. Political dissidents and whistleblowers have been silenced with deepfake confessions of crimes they never committed. In some cases, these false admissions have led to arrests and even executions. Why it's so effective? The terrifying part about digital schizophrenia is that our brains are wired to trust evidence. If we see a video, hear a voice message, or read a conversation, we instinctively believe it must be real. When confronted with false evidence of their own actions, victims experience extreme cognitive dissonance. Over time, they start questioning their own memories, leading to paranoia, anxiety, and mental exhaustion. How to protect yourself? As technology advances, so do the methods of deception. But there are ways to safeguard against digital schizophrenia. 1. Be skeptical of digital evidence. Not everything you see, hear. Always verify suspicious emails, texts, or recordings before reacting. 2. Use digital authentication tools. Enable two-factor authentication as 2FA to prevent account hijacking. Use PGP encryption to verify email authenticity. Check email headers and metadata to detect spoofing. 3. Limit your digital footprint. Avoid posting too many voice or video samples online. Be mindful of AI-powered tools that can mimic your speech or writing style. Use a VPN to prevent IP tracking and spoofing. 4. Verify information before acting. If someone presents a chat log, email, or video as proof, demand metadata or forensic analysis. And look for AI-generated inconsistencies in deepfake videos, such as unnatural eye movements or glitches around the mouth. 5. Document everything. Keep records of important communications and store them securely. Use timestamping services to prove the authenticity of messages. Take screenshots and save backups of crucial digital interactions. Final thoughts. Digital schizophrenia is one of the most insidious psychological manipulations of the modern era. By exploiting AI-generated deception, bad actors can gaslight individuals into questioning their own reality. The consequences can be devastating. Ruined reputations, destroyed relationships, and severe mental distress. But knowledge is power. By understanding this tactic and taking steps to protect yourself, you can safeguard against digital deception. In a world where artificial intelligence can rewrite history, staying vigilant is your best defense. Dead agenting, the art of psychological assassination. Imagine uncovering a massive scandal, one that could shake an entire industry, government, or corporation. You gather evidence, prepare to expose the truth, and just when you're about to go public, your credibility is completely destroyed. Suddenly, false allegations surface about your past. People are whispering rumors that you're a fraud, a criminal, or mentally unstable. Articles appear online questioning your character. A video surfaces, heavily edited, making you look like a liar. By the time you try to defend yourself, no one believes you. Your words, no matter how true, sound like desperate lies. This is dead agenting, a powerful psychological attack technique used in propaganda, intelligence operations, and corporate warfare. It's designed to completely discredit a target through false allegations, rumors, and character assassination, making anything they say, especially the truth, seem unreliable. The goal: to destroy their credibility so completely that even factual information coming from them is ignored or dismissed. How dead agenting works. Dead agenting is a preemptive strike on credibility. Instead of countering someone's argument with facts, this method destroys the messenger so that their message is no longer taken seriously. Here's how it's done. 1. Digging up or fabricating scandal. Attackers look for any skeletons in a target's closet, exaggerating or misrepresenting past mistakes. If no dirt exists, they manufacture false claims. Anything from fraud, infidelity, or financial misconduct to more serious allegations like abuse or treason. 2. Planting false stories. Anonymous sources leak damaging stories to the media. Blogs, social media posts, and news articles start circulating, questioning the target's integrity. Fake screenshots, emails, or videos may be created to prove the accusations. 3. Coordinated smear campaigns. Influencers, journalists, or paid operatives begin discussing the allegations as if they are fact. Fake social media accounts amplify the rumors, creating the illusion of widespread belief. The target's past statements are twisted out of context to paint them as untrustworthy. 4. Gaslighting and psychological warfare. The target is made to feel isolated, doubting their own reality. Every attempt to defend themselves is spun as further proof that they are guilty. Associates and colleagues may distance themselves out of fear of association. Real-world examples of dead agenting. Dead agenting has been used in politics, business, and activism for decades. Here are some famous cases. Whistleblowers discredited. Many corporate and government whistleblowers have been destroyed through character attacks. When Edward Snowden exposed mass surveillance programs, the US government didn't just argue against his claims. They painted him as a traitor, shifting the conversation away from the truth he revealed. Journalists silenced. Investigative journalists uncovering corruption often find themselves accused of bias, fraud, or even crimes. Once their reputation is tarnished, their reports lose credibility, even if backed by solid evidence. Corporate takeovers. In the business world, executives have been ousted through well-orchestrated smear campaigns. Anonymous whistleblowers leak damaging, often fabricated, stories, forcing resignations or stock market crashes. A political assassination in elections. Candidates frequently use dead agenting against opponents. Instead of debating policies, they destroy reputations, leaking old college photos, twisting past statements, or even spreading fake scandals. Why dead agenting is so effective? This technique works because people respond to emotions more than facts. Once doubt is planted, it's incredibly hard to remove. Here's why it's so powerful. 1. Where there's smoke, there's fire effect. Even if allegations are false, repeated exposure makes people assume something must be true. When multiple sources say the same thing, people believe it, even if those sources are coordinated. 2. Social proof and herd mentality. If the majority seems to believe a rumor, individuals are more likely to accept it. Friends, family, and colleagues may distance themselves, reinforcing the illusion that the accused is guilty. 3. Defensive statements sound like lies. When people try to prove their innocence, they often come across as guilty. Over-explaining or showing emotional distress makes them seem desperate, further fueling the accusations. 4. Cognitive dissonance. Once someone believes a lie, they resist evidence that contradicts it. If they've already judged a person as dishonest, they filter all future information through that lens. How to defend yourself against dead agenting. If you become a target of dead agenting, fighting back is difficult, but not impossible. Here's how to protect yourself. 1. Establish your reputation before attacks occur. The stronger your credibility, the harder it is to discredit you. Build a strong network of allies who can vouch for your integrity. Control the narrative early. If you sense an attack coming, address it first. Being proactive allows you to define the conversation before others do. 3. Demand hard evidence. Many allegations rely on innuendo or vague claims. Ask for specific proof and challenge inconsistencies in the accusations. 4. Avoid over-explaining. Defending yourself too aggressively can make you look guilty. Instead, stay calm, state the facts, and let your actions prove your credibility. 5. Expose the attackers. If you can prove a smear campaign is happening, make it public. Showing coordination between bad actors can turn the narrative in your favor. 6. Use legal action if necessary. False allegations and libelous claims can sometimes be challenged in court. Cease and desist letters, defamation lawsuits, or digital forensics can help expose manipulation. Final thoughts. Dead agenting is one of the most brutal psychological attacks used in modern warfare. Whether in politics, business, or social activism, it doesn't just destroy reputations, it makes truth itself sound like a lie. In an age where misinformation spreads faster than facts, understanding this technique is crucial. By recognizing the signs and preparing for potential attacks, you can protect yourself from becoming a victim of character assassination. Trauma anchoring. The psychological chains of manipulation. Imagine feeling a wave of panic every time you consider standing up for yourself. You don't know why, only that it feels unsafe. Certain words, actions, or even thoughts send a cold chill down your spine. This isn't just fear. It's trauma anchoring, a powerful manipulation tactic that ties a person's trauma response to a specific action, idea, or behavior. Over time, the victim unconsciously avoids these triggers, even if they don't remember why they're afraid. It's a form of psychological conditioning that keeps people controlled. silenced, or stuck in toxic cycles. How trauma anchoring works. At its core, trauma anchoring is the brain's associative memory, the mechanism that links emotions to experiences. By repeatedly pairing distress with a specific trigger, manipulators create invisible boundaries that dictate what a person can think, say, or do. Here's how it happens step by step. 1. The creation of the anchor. A traumatic event is intentionally or unintentionally linked to a trigger. For example, an abusive partner might scream and throw objects whenever their victim talks about leaving. Over time, the victim's brain connects talking about leaving with danger, causing an automatic fear response. 2. Reinforcement through repetition. The abuser repeats the traumatic reaction consistently, reinforcing the link. The victim learns to avoid triggering the response, even subconsciously. 3. Generalization. The trauma response spreads beyond the original trigger. If the original trigger was talking about leaving, the victim may later feel anxious just thinking about leaving. This expands the control the manipulator has, limiting the victim's ability to make independent decisions. Examples of trauma anchoring in action. This form of psychological manipulation is found in abusive relationships, cult indoctrination, political propaganda, and even childhood conditioning. Here are some real-world examples. 1. Abusive relationships. A partner gets furious whenever their spouse questions their actions. Over time, the spouse associates asking questions with danger and stops questioning anything. Even when the abuser isn't present, the fear lingers, preventing independent thought. 2. Childhood conditioning. A child is repeatedly scolded or punished whenever they express sadness. Eventually, they learn to suppress emotions, believing that sadness itself is bad. As an adult, they struggle with emotional repression and can't communicate feelings properly. 3. Workplace manipulation. A toxic boss publicly humiliates employees who challenge them. The employees quickly learn that speaking up leads to distress. Even after leaving that workplace, they may feel anxious in any job where they need to voice their opinion. 4. Cult mind control. Members who question the leader's teachings are ostracized or punished. Others witness this and develop an automatic fear of questioning authority. Even years after leaving, ex-members feel a lingering fear of independent thinking. 5. Political and social manipulation. A government or media outlet repeatedly associates certain topics with fear or punishment. Citizens develop an unconscious aversion to discussing or even considering those topics. This ensures compliance without the need for direct enforcement. Why trauma anchoring is so effective? Trauma anchoring works because it bypasses logic and embeds fear directly into a person's emotional core. Here's why it's so powerful. 1. Triggers bypass rational thought. The brain's amygdala, at the fear center, reacts before logic can intervene. Even if a person knows the fear is irrational, they feel it deeply and instinctively avoid the trigger. 2. Creates self-enforcing boundaries. The victim avoids certain actions without needing direct control. The manipulator no longer needs to reinforce the fear. It operates automatically. 3. Can last a lifetime. A trauma anchors can persist long after the abusive situation ends. Even if the person logically knows they are safe, the emotional response remains. 4. Difficult to detect. Many victims don't realize they've been conditioned. Since the fear feels internal, they blame themselves instead of recognizing manipulation. How to break free from trauma anchoring. Healing from trauma anchoring requires rewiring the brain and confronting the conditioned responses. Here's how to start. 1. Identify the anchor. Pay attention to irrational fears or extreme emotional reactions. Ask yourself, when did I first feel this way? Who made me feel this way? 2. Challenge the fear response. Expose yourself to the trigger in small, controlled doses. If you fear speaking up, start by writing your thoughts before verbalizing them. If you fear discussing certain topics, talk about them with a trusted friend. 3. Reframe the narrative. Recognize that the fear is a conditioned response, not reality. Replace negative thoughts with affirmations. Speaking my mind is safe. My emotions are valid. I am not in danger for thinking freely. 4. Work with a therapist. Professional guidance can help break deep-rooted trauma responses. Cognitive behavioral therapy, as CBT, is especially effective in reprogramming negative associations. 5. Rewrite the associations. Create new, positive experiences linked to the old trigger. If you were punished for speaking up, Start voicing your thoughts in safe environments until confidence grows. How to protect yourself from trauma anchoring. If you recognize someone using this tactic against you, take steps to protect yourself. 1. Stay aware of emotional manipulation. If someone consistently reacts aggressively to certain topics, question why. Ask yourself, are they trying to make me afraid of something? 2. Maintain personal autonomy. Be mindful of who influences your thoughts and decisions. If you start avoiding certain behaviors out of fear, examine where that fear comes from. 3. Create a support system. Isolation makes trauma anchoring more effective. Surround yourself with people who encourage independent thinking and emotional validation. 4. Set boundaries against toxic people. If someone consistently triggers trauma responses, distance yourself if possible. If you can't cut ties completely, limit interactions and maintain control over your own reactions. Final thoughts. Trauma anchoring is one of the most insidious manipulation tactics because it turns a person's own mind into a prison. By linking trauma responses to specific actions or thoughts, manipulators create invisible barriers that keep victims trapped, even long after the manipulation ends. But knowledge is power. Recognizing trauma anchoring is the first step toward breaking free. By identifying fear-based responses, challenging irrational triggers, and reclaiming autonomy, anyone can undo the conditioning and regain control over their own mind. The abandonment shock, the psychological trap of rapid withdrawal. Imagine forming an intense emotional bond with someone, whether a romantic partner, a mentor, a community, or a trusted friend, make you feel seen, valued, and understood in a way no one else has. Then, suddenly, they disappear. No explanation, no warning, just a cold, empty void where warmth once existed. This is the abandonment shock, a psychological manipulation tactic designed to create emotional dependency by first overwhelming the target with attention and affection, then withdrawing suddenly to leave them emotionally destabilized. This method is often used in cult indoctrination, extreme love, bombing relationships, and criminal interrogations, leveraging the human brain's need for connection to gain control over the target. How abandonment shock works. At its core, this tactic weaponizes the brain's attachment system and dopamine reward pathways. By creating an intense bond, and then abruptly severing it, the target experiences distress similar to withdrawal from an addictive substance. Here's how it unfolds. 1. The bonding phase, love bombing and trust building. The manipulator showers the target with affection, validation, and attention. They present themselves as a uniquely supportive, understanding, or charismatic figure. The target feels an overwhelming sense of connection and trust. This phase builds emotional dependence, where the target begins associating happiness and stability with the manipulator. 2. The sudden withdrawal, emotional shock and despair. The manipulator abruptly pulls away, stopping communication, withholding affection, or even cutting the target off completely. The target experiences a sharp emotional pain, confusion, and desperation. Their brain, used to constant validation, enters a state of emotional panic. The lack of closure and unpredictability triggers an obsessive need to regain connection. 3. The cycle of reinforcement, manipulative control. To relieve their distress, the target seeks out the manipulator, willing to compromise boundaries or submit to demands, just to feel close again. The manipulator may offer small moments of reconnection, reinforcing the dependency. Over time, the target internalizes fear of abandonment, making them more compliant and emotionally fragile. Psychological mechanisms behind abandonment shock. The effectiveness of this tactic is rooted in deep psychological and neurological responses to 1. Attachment trauma. Humans are wired to seek connection. When an intense bond is suddenly severed, the brain reacts as if it's in survival crisis mode. 2. Dopamine addiction. The bonding phase floods the target with dopamine, reinforcing pleasure. When this source of dopamine is taken away, the withdrawal symptoms make the target crave reconnection. 3. Intermittent reinforcement. Occasional moments of reconnection make the bond stronger, like a gambler waiting for their next win. 4. Cognitive dissonance. The target struggles to reconcile the loving persona from the bonding phase with the sudden coldness, often blaming themselves rather than recognizing manipulation. Real-world examples of abandonment shock. This technique appears across various scenarios, from personal relationships to large-scale ideological manipulation. 1. Cult indoctrination. Cults often engage in intense love bombing, making new recruits feel uniquely special and wanted. Once the individual is deeply emotionally invested, the cult leader withdraws approval or threatens exile. The fear of abandonment causes members to suppress doubts, obey orders, and seek validation at all costs. 2. Abusive relationships and love bombing. Narcissistic partners may overwhelm their victim with love and attention, creating deep emotional dependence. They then withdraw emotionally, often blaming the victim for the shift. The victim, desperate to regain the initial affection, may accept blame, lower standards, or tolerate mistreatment just to fix things. 3. Criminal interrogations and psychological warfare. Interrogators use abandonment shock by alternating between friendly connection and cold hostility. Prisoners or suspects may emotionally latch onto their interrogator when they are kind, seeking to earn back their favor by complying. This tactic is used to extract confessions, create informants, or psychologically break a target. 4. Social media and public figures. Influencers, political figures, or public personalities can manipulate their audience by engaging deeply, then abruptly withdrawing or threatening exile. Followers experience distress and increase loyalty or engagement in hopes of regaining connection. The long-term effects of abandonment shock. Victims of this tactic often experience lasting psychological wounds, anxiety and fear of rejection. The unpredictability of connection creates long-term emotional instability. Low self-worth. Victims blame themselves for the withdrawal, questioning their value. Or addiction to toxic relationships. The cycle of high-intensity bonding and loss becomes familiar, leading victims to unconsciously seek similar relationships. Difficulty trusting healthy bonds. Victims may struggle with relationships, fearing any deep connection will end in sudden abandonment. How to recognize and protect yourself. Understanding the mechanics of abandonment shock is key to breaking free from its grip. Here's how to protect yourself. 1. Identify manipulative patterns. Be wary of anyone who bombs excessively or creates rapid emotional intimacy. If someone suddenly withdraws affection or communication after intense bonding, recognize it as a manipulation strategy. 2. Resist the urge to chase. When someone withdraws, your instinct may be to fix things. Instead, pause and reflect. Are you seeking genuine connection or responding to an engineered emotional panic? 3. Rebuild internal stability. Ground yourself in reality. Your worth is not dependent on someone else's attention. Or engage in activities that bring you personal fulfillment outside of relationships. 4. Set firm boundaries. Don't let the fear of losing someone make you tolerate mistreatment. If someone's behavior consistently causes distress, limit their influence over you. 5. Seek support. Talk to trusted friends, a therapist, or a support group. Rebuilding a strong sense of self takes time but is crucial in breaking free from manipulative cycles. Final thoughts. The abandonment shock is one of the most powerful psychological traps, designed to create dependency, weaken autonomy, and make individuals emotionally vulnerable. By recognizing this manipulation, resisting the urge to chase lost validation, and focusing on building self-worth independent of external approval, you can break free from this toxic cycle and reclaim control over your emotions and relationships. Knowledge is the key to protection. The more you understand these tactics, the less power they have over you. The false guilt injection. How manipulators weaponize guilt to control you. Guilt is a powerful emotion, one that can shape our decisions, influence our behaviors, and even alter our self-perception. When used ethically, guilt helps people take responsibility for their actions. But in the wrong hands, guilt becomes a weapon, a tool of control. This is where the false guilt injection comes into play. This psychological manipulation strategy involves making someone feel guilty for things they never did or had no control over. By planting false guilt, manipulators keep their target in a state of emotional debt, making them easy to exploit and control. How false guilt injection works. At its core, this tactic preys on the target's conscience and sense of responsibility. Here's how manipulators use false guilt to their advantage. 1. Establishing a moral obligation. The manipulator convinces the target that they are somehow responsible for an event, emotion, or situation, even if they had no actual role in it. This can be done subtly through phrases like, "I wouldn't be struggling so much if you had just helped me more. You're lucky I even put up with you after what you've done. I sacrificed so much for you, and this is how you repay me." The goal is to make the target feel obligated to make amends for something they didn't actually cause. 2. Reinforcing the emotional debt. Once the target starts to feel guilty, the manipulator deepens the guilt, bringing up past events that often exaggerated or misrepresented to keep the target feeling responsible, and comparing them to others who have supposedly done more or been better, but expressing disappointment in a way that suggests the target has morally failed. The victim now believes they have a moral debt they must repay, whether through compliance, emotional support, or financial assistance. 3. Exploiting the target's need for redemption. People naturally want to repair damage and relieve guilt, even if that guilt is misplaced. The manipulator ensures that the only way to fix things is by giving in to their demands. That the target may apologize unnecessarily, accept blame for things outside their control, go out of their way to please the manipulator, often at their own expense. And the more the victim tries to make things right, the more entrenched they become in the manipulator's control. Psychological mechanisms behind false guilt injection. This tactic works because it hijacks fundamental psychological and emotional responses. 1. Cognitive dissonance. The target believes they are a good person, but that the manipulator makes them feel like they've done something bad. To resolve this conflict, they may overcompensate by complying with the manipulator's wishes. 2. Empathy exploitation. People with strong empathy are more likely to internalize guilt, making them ideal targets for this form of manipulation. 3. Fear of conflict or abandonment. The target may go along with the guilt to avoid arguments, rejection, or disapproval. 4. Authority and power imbalance. If the manipulator is a parent, boss, or mentor, the target may feel obligated to believe them simply due to the power dynamic. Real-world examples of false guilt injection. This tactic is widespread and can appear in different settings, from personal relationships to large-scale social manipulation. 1. Narcissistic parents and toxic families. A parent might blame a child for their personal unhappiness. If you weren't so difficult growing up, I would have had a better life. A family members might use guilt to control behavior, such as shaming someone for not following traditions or for pursuing independent goals. 2. Abusive romantic relationships. A partner may guilt-trip the other into staying in a toxic relationship. If you leave me, I don't know what I'll do to myself. And they may also blame their partner for their own bad behavior. I wouldn't have yelled at you if you weren't so difficult. 3. Workplace manipulation. A boss might make an employee feel guilty for setting boundaries. After everything I've done for you, you're really going to take a vacation now. Co-workers may use guilt to offload responsibilities onto someone else. I thought you were a team player, but I guess I was wrong. 4. Political and social manipulation. Certain groups may attempt to make entire populations feel guilty for past events they had no personal involvement in, using this guilt to push an agenda. Governments or institutions may guilt citizens into compliance by framing dissent as betrayal or selfishness. The long-term effects of false guilt injection, and victims of this tactic can suffer significant psychological and emotional damage. The chronic self-doubt. The victim begins questioning their own actions, even when they've done nothing wrong. Constant anxiety, fear of disappointing others, or making mistakes becomes overwhelming. Burnout and emotional exhaustion, constantly trying to make up for imagined wrongs, drains mental energy. Difficulty setting boundaries. The victim struggles to say no, even when they're being unfairly used. How to recognize and break free from false guilt injection. 1. Identify the signs. Ask yourself, am I feeling guilty over something I actually did, or something someone is making me feel responsible for? If someone regularly makes you feel guilty without a clear reason, you may be experiencing manipulation. 2. Reframe the narrative. Recognize that just because someone feels hurt or disappointed doesn't mean you've done something wrong. Replace guilt with logic. Did I actually do anything harmful, or is this person twisting the situation? 3. Set clear boundaries. Say no without over-explaining or apologizing. If someone repeatedly makes you feel guilty for things outside your control, limit your interactions with them. 4. Stop overcompensating. You don't need to prove your worth by constantly making up for things that were never your fault. Resist the urge to placate manipulators just to keep the peace. 5. Seek external perspective. Talking to a trusted friend, therapist, or support group can help you see the manipulation more clearly. as sometimes an outside perspective is the key to breaking the cycle. Final thoughts. The false guilt injection is a powerful tool of control, used to keep people in a state of emotional submission. By recognizing when guilt is being falsely placed upon you, refusing to accept responsibility for things outside your control, and setting firm boundaries, you can break free from this psychological trap. Guilt should come from true wrongdoing, not from someone else's desire to control you. Learn to distinguish the difference, and reclaim your emotional freedom. The shattered identity effect. How manipulators strip away identity to gain control. Identity is the foundation of who we are, our beliefs, values, memories, and sense of self. It provides stability, guiding our decisions and shaping our relationships. However, when identity is systematically dismantled, a person can be left vulnerable, confused, and entirely dependent on an external force for direction. This phenomenon is known as the shattered identity effect, a psychological manipulation tactic designed to strip a person of their individuality and make them more susceptible to control. This technique is frequently used in cult indoctrination, extreme abuse situations, and even covert psychological conditioning programs such as MK Ultra style experiments. How the shattered identity effect works. At its core, the shattered identity effect follows a predictable pattern. The manipulator's goal is to break down the target's existing identity and replace it with one that serves their agenda. This is typically achieved in 4 key stages. 1. Isolating the target from their support systems. The process often begins by cutting the person off from external influences, friends, family, and even societal norms. This can be done by physically separating them, every location, imprisonment, or isolation in a controlled environment, creating an us versus them mentality, where the target is made to distrust those outside the manipulator's influence, instilling fear that the outside world is dangerous or deceptive. Example: cult leaders often encourage members to sever ties with corrupt family members, ensuring the cult is the only source of truth and stability. 2. Breaking down the target's core beliefs and values. Once isolated, the target's beliefs and values are systematically attacked. This is achieved through a gaslighting, making the target question their past experiences and memories, a forced contradictions, pushing them to accept new ideas that conflict with their previous values, a shame and guilt tactics, making them feel morally or intellectually inferior for holding on to their former beliefs. An example: in high-control groups, individuals may be forced to confess their sins publicly, creating a cycle of guilt and submission. 3. Erasing personal identity markers. A person's name, clothing, and personal choices are all extensions of their identity. Stripping these away accelerates the process of control. This can involve giving the target a new name or title, e.g., Brother Michael, instead of their birth name. In enforcing uniformity in dress and behavior, removing personal expression, and destroying sentimental objects linked to their past, photos, personal belongings, or journals. An example: many extremist cults require members to adopt new names and wear specific clothing, reinforcing that their past self is dead. 4. Implanting a new, controlled identity. Once the old identity is shattered, a new persona is imposed, one that is fully shaped by the manipulator's ideology. This is reinforced through a repetitive indoctrination, daily lectures, rituals, or propaganda, a surveillance and punishment to ensure compliance, creating dependency by making the target believe they cannot survive without the manipulator's guidance. An example: in military-style brainwashing programs, captives are often given new ideological beliefs and forced to denounce their past allegiances under extreme duress. Psychological mechanisms behind the shattered identity effect. This tactic works because it hijacks fundamental psychological principles. 1. Cognitive dissonance. When a person is forced to hold conflicting beliefs, they may abandon their old identity to resolve the internal conflict. 2. Neuroplasticity. The brain adapts to repeated exposure to new ideas, behaviors, and identities, making the changes feel natural over time. 3. Learned helplessness. When subjected to enough mental and emotional abuse, the victim may stop resisting and accept the new reality. 4. Trauma bonding. The victim may develop a psychological attachment to their abuser, reinforcing their dependence. Real-world examples of the shattered identity effect. This technique has been used throughout history in various high-control environments. 1. Cult indoctrination. Cults are masterful at identity destruction. They isolate new recruits from their former lives, assign new names, clothing, and ideologies, use groupthink and psychological conditioning to enforce total conformity. Example, the infamous Jonestown cult required members to renounce their past, adopt a new communal lifestyle, and obey Jim Jones without question. 2. MK Ultra and psychological warfare. The CIA's MK Ultra program in 1950s-70s experimented with erasing and rewriting identities through extreme means, including drugs, hypnosis, and psychological torture. The victims were often left in a state of confusion and dependency, making them more susceptible to control. 3. Extreme domestic abuse. Abusive relationships can mirror cult dynamics. The abuser isolates the victim from friends and family. The victim's sense of self is eroded through verbal, emotional, and physical abuse. The abuser dictates how the victim thinks, acts, and perceives reality. Example: survivors of long-term abuse often report feeling like they lost their sense of identity and autonomy. 4. Military and prisoner conditioning. In extreme military training and prisoner of war camps, identity breaking is used to turn individuals into obedient soldiers or compliant captives. Example: North Korean prisoner camps use relentless propaganda and torture to replace a prisoner's old worldview with state-approved ideology. The long-term effects of a shattered identity. Victims of this manipulation often suffer from dissociation, identity confusion, struggling to remember who they once were, and severe anxiety and depression, feeling lost, hopeless, or emotionally numb, PTSD and complex trauma, ongoing flashbacks, and difficulty trusting others. Dependency issues, struggling to function independently without external authority. How to recognize and resist the shattered identity effect. 1. Identify early warning signs. Be wary of groups or individuals who pressure you to abandon past relationships or beliefs, force uniformity in thought, dress, or behavior, use shame and guilt to erode your confidence. 2. Reconnect with your true identity. Keep personal mementos and records, journals, photos, letters to anchor yourself to your past. Surround yourself with supportive friends and family who affirm your individuality. 3. Resist isolation and forced dependency. Maintain multiple sources of support and information to avoid falling into a controlled echo chamber. If someone discourages independent thought, question their motives. 4. Seek professional help. If you or someone you know has been affected by identity manipulation, therapy can help rebuild self-trust and autonomy. Trauma-informed counselors can assist in reconstructing a healthy sense of self. Final thoughts. The shattered identity effect is one of the most extreme forms of psychological manipulation. By dismantling a person's sense of self, manipulators gain absolute control. Recognizing the warning signs and resisting attempts to erode identity are crucial steps in protecting personal autonomy. Your identity is your own. Guard it, nurture it, and never let anyone take it from you. The manufactured hero syndrome, how manipulators create dependency through fake rescues. In this world where trust and security are highly valued, a few figures are as powerful as a hero, the person who swoops in to save the day when all hope seems lost. But what happens when that hero is also the cause of the crisis they claim to fix? This is the foundation of the manufactured hero syndrome, a dark psychological manipulation tactic where a person, group, or institution deliberately creates a problem, only to rescue the target from it. This strategy fosters deep loyalty, emotional dependence, and a distorted perception of the manipulator as a savior rather than the source of distress. It is a psychological trick used in toxic relationships, cult dynamic, political propaganda, and corporate or governmental control mechanisms. How the manufactured hero syndrome works. The manufactured hero syndrome follows a three-stage process. 1. Creating the crisis. The manipulator intentionally introduces a problem into the victim's life. This can take many forms: emotional turmoil, sabotaging the victim's confidence, relationships or stability, physical danger, putting the victim in actual harm or perceived danger, financial hardship, orchestrating a situation where the victim loses money or opportunities, social sabotage, turning others against the victim to make them feel alone. Example: a toxic partner might start fights, gaslight, or create drama, making the victim feel emotionally destabilized and vulnerable. 2. Playing the savior. Once the victim is overwhelmed by the manufactured crisis, the manipulator steps in to help. This often involves offering comfort and reassurance, making the victim feel grateful, appearing competent and powerful, reinforcing their position of authority. using selective kindness to confuse the victim and make them dependent. Example: a manipulative boss who first overburdens an employee with unrealistic tasks, then later saves them by extending deadlines, creating a false sense of gratitude and obligation. 3. Reinforcing dependence over time. The victim starts to see the manipulator as indispensable. The cycle continues, making the victim fearful of independence because they believe they need the manipulator's help. Emotionally attached to the person who rescued them. Unaware of the manipulation, believing the crisis was random or self-inflicted. Example: a government may exaggerate or fabricate external threats, then present itself as the only force capable of protecting its citizens, ensuring continued control and compliance. Psychological mechanisms behind the manufactured hero syndrome. Several psychological principles make this manipulation highly effective. The Stockholm Syndrome effect. When someone experiences intense stress or danger, they may bond with the person who provides them with relief, even if that person caused the initial harm. Victims often feel grateful to their rescuer, overlooking the harm they endured. Intermittent reinforcement. The manipulator provides help only after causing distress, creating an emotional roller coaster. This unpredictability makes the victim crave the manipulator's approval and assistance. Gaslighting and perception control. The victim may be manipulated into believing they caused their own suffering, making them more likely to see the manipulator as a savior rather than an abuser. Learned helplessness. Repeated exposure to crisis rescue cycles can make the victim feel incapable of solving their own problems, reinforcing dependence. Real-world examples of the manufactured hero syndrome. This psychological trick is commonly found in various aspects of society, from personal relationships to large-scale propaganda. 1. Toxic relationships. Manipulative partners create unnecessary fights or emotional distress, only to later make up with love and affection. Narcissistic parents may emotionally damage their children, then present themselves as the only ones who truly understand or support them. Example: a boyfriend falsely accuses his partner of cheating, causing emotional distress. Later, he forgives her, making her feel grateful and proving his love. 2. Political propaganda and government control. Governments throughout history have exaggerated or fabricated threats to keep populations dependent. Some leaders use fear tactics to justify their rule, claiming to be the only ones capable of keeping people safe. Example: a government creates or exaggerates a security crisis, then enforces strict laws for protection, gaining more power. 3. Corporate manipulation. Businesses sometimes create artificial problems so they can sell solutions. Example: a tech company might release intentionally flawed software, later fixing it with a paid update, making customers feel grateful. Another example: beauty industry that first promotes insecurities about natural aging, then offers solutions in the form of expensive treatments. 4. Religious and cult manipulation. Cult leaders often manufacture crises, apocalyptic prophecies, moral dilemmas to make followers reliant on them for guidance. Example: a cult convinces members that the outside world is corrupt and dangerous, making them fear leaving and believe the cult is their only sanctuary. The long-term impact on victims. Victims of the manufactured hero syndrome often suffer from loss of autonomy, feeling unable to function without the manipulator. Emotional instability, living in constant highs and lows due to the crisis rescue cycle. Distorted reality, struggling to recognize manipulation, often blaming themselves. Trust issues, difficulty distinguishing genuine help from manipulation. How to recognize and break free from the manufactured hero syndrome. 1. Identify patterns of unnecessary crisis. Are problems always emerging conveniently for the manipulator to fix? Do you feel relieved yet dependent after every rescue? 2. Question the source of your problems. Who or what is really causing the distress? Are you being made to believe you are at fault? 3. Develop self-sufficiency. Learn problem-solving skills to reduce dependence on external rescuers. Strengthen relationships with independent, supportive people outside the manipulator's influence. 4. Seek external perspectives. Talk to trusted individuals who are not under the manipulator's control. Consider professional therapy to gain clarity and rebuild autonomy. Final thoughts. The manufactured hero syndrome is one of the most insidious psychological tricks used by manipulators. By creating the very problems they later solve, they ensure loyalty, dependency, and control over their victims, whether in relationships, politics, business, or cult dynamics. This tactic exploits fear and gratitude to trap people in an endless cycle of crisis and rescue. The key to breaking free is recognizing the pattern, questioning the origins of your distress, and rebuilding your confidence in solving your own problems. Genuine help empowers, false heroism enslaves. True heroes don't manufacture crises, they prevent them.